Welcome back, my friends. My name is Sarah. I am known as Carnivore Yogi. Thank you so much for being here and clicking on today's video. Today I have a treat for you. It is the full episode with Elliot Overton, where we go over all things histamine issues, gut issues on the carnivore diet. We also talk about some of the most common problems that he sees people that struggle with on the carnivore diet. Now, there are parts 1 and 2 of this, but this is the full episode. So many of you did comment below that last video I did and ask for the full episode. So I wanted to go ahead and give that to you guys. Thank you for your feedback. I always love to hear from you guys. And I also want to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is going to be Thrive. You guys know I have used the Thrive Gut Health Test for the last year, actually. And now my subscribers are able to get up to 70% off of the gut health test. It is usually $200. You can actually get it for $59 by using my link, which will be in the information section below for you guys. And this is a gut health test that can actually tell you what is going on in your gut. It helped me understand that I was not processing protein. I was not breaking protein down properly. And from there, I was able to take proper steps to start to heal my gut. Now, some of that stuff Elliot and I do talk about in this episode. The other cool thing about Thrive is that you can get a custom probiotic based on your gut health test. So you get the gut health test, you can look at those results and then decide whether or not you want to get a custom probiotic based specifically on what your gut health sample says. So that's a really big advantage. A lot of people that try probiotics, they don't do well with them. They have reactions to them because they are not customized. So again, this is a great offer for you guys. It is over 70% off if you use my link, which is in the information section below for you guys. And thank you to Thrive for sponsoring this video. I hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Elliot Overton. I will be glad to have him back on. If you guys have additional questions, just comment below. He was really wonderful to talk to. He's so brilliant, so knowledgeable. And please head on over to his channels to follow him on social media. All right, guys, thanks again and enjoy this episode.
All right, guys, thank you so much for coming back and tuning in. I'm really excited about today's guest. Elliot Overton is, I feel, an expert in this field, and I have a lot of interesting questions to ask him today. So thank you, Elliot, for being here today.
You're perfectly welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, if you don't mind, before we jump into questions, can you talk a little bit about your background and expertise? I know a lot of us have just kind of binged watched a lot of your videos that are in the carnivore and keto space, but would you mind talking about your background just a little bit?
Yeah, of course. I'm a nutritionist based in the UK. I have done some training in what's called functional medicine. I'm not a medical doctor, but I am interested in how we can apply nutrition in the context of chronic disease and how people can try to improve their health via natural methods. So I tend to work with a lot of people who are on carnivore diets or ketogenic or animal-based diets. This has been the case for 3 years or so. So I have a particular interest in this myself. I've followed these kinds of diets for a long time. Before I started working with people with this dietary preference, let's say. And over the years, I've kind of honed in on some of the key issues which I often see people have in this regard. They might do these kind of diets and then either they don't feel benefits or they feel some benefits, but things are holding them back, or they actually get worse. So I'm interested in kind of why that happens and how people can try to troubleshoot that in various ways. And yeah, I guess that's kind of an overview.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's exactly why I wanted to bring you on, is I feel like you've really worked so hard to try to understand why people run into specific problems on these types of diets, because I think they are very helpful to do. But then how do you help the people when they just have, these kind of chronic issues that we'll start to talk about today?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Cool. Well, the first question, and these are kind of for people listening, not in any specific order, just kind of what came to mind when I was sending Elliot some questions. I wanted to talk about having high blood urea nitrogen, high creatinine, people that are concerned about the strain on their kidneys from these diets. And then I know we often see a low EGFR, and just kind of what your thoughts are on that topic.
Yeah, okay. So you have to take this for what it's worth. I'm not a medical doctor, as you know, and for all the listeners, this definitely isn't medical advice, but I'm sure your listeners know that already. I just have to kind of preface what I say with that. Okay, yeah. So this is something that you have seen.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
had it myself, and now I've corrected it. But I had it after a year of carnivore. My BUN was out of range, my creatinine was high, and my GFR was down to like a 60. And I was terrified. Yeah, I was very, very worried about this. And then, of course, I put my blood work on the internet, and I got trolled by a bunch of vegans. And then they were saying things like, I hope Sean Baker visits you when you're on dialysis. And it was really scary. Now my GFR is a 110 and everything's in range and I'm in a good spot. But it's always kind of been in my mind of like, this happens to a lot of people that I see, and I want to know why, and then what's the best way to help them.
Okay, and just before we go into that, I'm kind of curious. You found a way to address this, right?
Yep.
And is that public how you did that?
Yeah, I stopped doing a super high protein carnivore.
Yeah.
That's what I was doing, was I was trying to do more of a high protein, low fat approach. And I had to really work hard on my electrolytes as well, because my electrolytes, I was very dehydrated. And I also have worked a lot on healing my gut as well. So those are the main things that I did. And now my numbers are all really good. Okay,
interesting. Yeah, that kind of relates to what I was going to kind of say to a large extent. With people who go on animal-based diets, if you look at various markers, you've got BUN, which is blood urea nitrogen. It's basically your total pool of like nitrogenous waste, which is primarily derived from protein, right? So it's consistent, or it's kind of logical to assume that the more protein someone eats, the more breakdown products of the protein they may have in the blood. So when you break down protein, you kind of liberate lots of different things. You liberate ammonia and nitrogen, etc., and you generate higher levels of something called urea. And now urea is generally part of one of these kind of panels. So if you're measuring urea in the blood and you see that that is high, well, that can be simply because someone is eating too much protein. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have some kind of a major metabolic issue going on.
Right.
So it's important to kind of, I guess, consider that the blood work of a carnivore is likely going to be different to the average person. And that's where a lot of the research and the understanding of physiology is based on, is an average person on a balanced diet. So when you're looking at a diet which is primarily protein, like a high protein diet with fat and very little or no carbohydrates, then things have to change, and we have to kind of account for that. So you can't apply the same rules to one group as you can to another, to some extent. So with regard to some of these markers, okay, you look at urea. Well, urea can be slightly elevated. It can be on the high side, and that's not necessarily a problem. That can mean that someone is just eating too much protein, or if they are, let's say, if they bodybuild, if they lift weights, if they do strenuous exercise and they're breaking down protein, muscle mass, and they're building it back up. This, again, theoretically could be one of the reasons why they see high urea. So that alone as a standalone marker is not necessarily all that informative. If you couple that with BUN, well, again, BUN protein is providing nitrogen for the body. Okay, we need to get rid of that. And so nitrogenous waste is toxic. We generally don't want high amounts of it for prolonged periods of time. If someone has kidney failure, they have very high levels of BUN. That's a really bad thing. But if it's ever so slightly on the high side, again, it can tell us some information, but it's not like diagnostic. So for instance, the BUN, it can just tell us that someone's eaten higher protein, or they are, they've been training hard or something like that. So those two markers, they're not necessarily problematic if they're ever so slightly on the higher side. When that's coupled with what is an estimate. It's called estimated glomerular filtration rate. That's probably one of the best estimates of kidney function that is available, kind of, to the wider public. Well, this is where it can be kind of important, as per my opinion. So GFR is meant to be above 60. Ordinarily, if you're sitting at around 60, that's still not great.
Yeah.
I like to see it anywhere between 90 and 100 or 110 kind of thing. And so if you notice, or if someone notices that they have high BUN, they have high urea, and they also have low glomerular filtration rate, and they see that happened after going on a ketogenic diet or a carnivorous diet, well, that is potentially a problem. And that kind of needs some investigation. So what I see this like really frequently. And for these people, oftentimes they don't have any other kind of signs and symptoms of a genuine like metabolic problem. They've no history of chronic kidney disease. They've no history of like liver disease, anything like that. They're generally, relatively speaking, healthy people, but they just have these really strange kidney markers, which have all of a sudden come on since they've been doing this crazy diet. Now, ordinarily, if someone looks at that and, it's understandable if they might conclude that this diet is unhealthy for them. And I would say it might be true, but it might be something a lot simpler, like what you've said. So first of all, it's important to note that glomerular filtration rate, what I understand about it, I'm not a specialist in kidney function or anything like that, but from what I understand, that fluctuates depending on various different factors. So you can measure GFR one day, and then you can measure GFR 1 or 2 days later, and it can fluctuate. So it can be on the lower side of normal, it can be on the low side, but then it can go higher again. And one of those, one of the factors which is going to determine a GFR is hydration. Okay, so if someone is dehydrated, that is one of the reasons why GFR can drop. Okay, at the same time, GFR is quite sensitive to acidity. Now, if you have been a vegan or you follow the vegan kind of standpoint on dietary protein, or you've bought into any of the conventional kind of dogma around dietary protein, they will say that protein is unhealthy for the kidneys because it's high, because it's acidic, because it does provide an acid. When it's broken down, it does provide acid for the body, and the body does need to excrete that. Now, there's lots of different mechanisms by which we're kind of maintaining acid-base homeostasis, so the balance between acidity and alkalinity. One of the ways in which we're doing that is through the kidneys. And so ordinarily a perfectly functioning kidney can quite well kind of maintain the balance between excreting acids and bases and whatnot, and maintaining kind of a relatively stable environment. However, the kidney is somewhat susceptible to excess acidity. So one of the ways in which the kidney can counteract that is by secreting bicarbonate. Okay, bicarbonate is an alkaline substance, and what that helps to do is basically balance things out. And so in some cases, like you have kind of clarified through your experience, and like what I've seen on numerous other occasions, is that someone who has low GFR, high BUN, and high urea might just be consuming a little bit too much protein. Okay. Yep. And that might not be coupled with their activity levels, with their kind of anabolic catabolic balance kind of thing. So if this particular kind of person is not working out heavily, if they are not kind of doing anything, providing stimulus to the muscles, which are going to kind of tell someone to build muscle, then and sometimes people, if they don't like eating fat, if they've come from kind of like a low fat diet, they can quite easily overeat on protein. And because of that, what I think one of the reasons why GFR goes down is because of the kind of excess burden the kidneys are placed under by having to deal with the nitrogenous waste, the acidity, etc., etc. So there's a couple of things that I have people do about this. I mean, one is to ideally reduce protein if I kind of think it is a little bit too much. It kind of depends. You have to do the calculation with each different person. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But one is making sure that someone is not eating excess protein. Secondly, looking at potentially providing, if it's highly concerning for that person and they're concerned that they've got kind of chronic kidney disease or kidney failure, it's really uncommon. But if they do think that, one way in which the researchers have done it in the past, and I use it in people who do have ongoing kidney issues, is actually to supplement with bicarbonate. So this could be either sodium bicarbonate or potassium bicarbonate. So the research is fairly conclusive that in chronic kidney disease, bicarbonate is a massively protective factor when it's supplemented, and it slows the progression. And I've seen GFRs go from 50 or below 60 to 80 in the space of, a month or so of supplementing with a quarter teaspoon or half a teaspoon of sodium bicarbonate. Really, that's going to depend on someone's urine pH. So one of the ways that you can kind of assess whether the acidity or acid base imbalance is potentially driving an issue with the kidneys is actually by looking at urinary pH. So you can get just a basic test strip. You can look at your pH levels, and what I like to see is ordinarily between kind of 6.9 and 7.5 kind of thing. Okay. So ever so slightly towards the alkaline range, but more kind of neutral. What you'll often find is people who do have this kind of lab work, their urine is going to be kind of 5.6 or below 6 or in the low 6s. And I find that this is also really, really helpful for people with gout. And that's something that kind of is its topic in its own sense. But carnivores who have this predisposition towards gout, using sodium potassium bicarbonate is really beneficial for kind of reducing gout attacks. Oftentimes their urine is highly acidic. So if you can bring that up to between 7 and 7.5 maybe, then what you'll often find is that the lab markers do tend to improve. Something else with regard to carnivore diets and poor kidney function, like a temporary worsening of kidney function. Well, one of those is theoretical, but I guess it probably could apply. Is one of the things which is known to reduce kidney function, or GFR, is advanced glycation end products. Okay, so this would usually be applicable for people who are on kind of standard Western diets, who are consuming high amounts of fructose, sugars, refined carbohydrates, polyunsaturated fats, like industrial seed oils. Advanced glycation end products are going to be a major problem. But it's also theoretically possible that this might also apply on someone who's on a carnivore diet, whose antioxidant system is not functioning kind of as it should do. Let's say their endogenous system to protect against advanced AGEs, the main thing there being glutathione, that's the main cellular antioxidant. If someone is not maintaining good glutathione status on a carnivore diet, and there's a couple of reasons why that might actually be, if they're not maintaining good glutathione status, then it's entirely possible that that over the long term, say a year or 18 months, that is going to start affecting the kidneys. The kidneys are massively or extremely sensitive to oxidative stress, and that's one of the things that the AGEs can do to the kidney to cause kidney damage. And in that case, what I also like to do is, if someone has done if they've tried to optimize their hydration, so their electrolytes, potassium, magnesium, even calcium, and sodium, if we have tried to look at that front, we've tried to do kind of the alkalinity stuff with the sodium bicarbonate or potassium bicarbonate. We've reduced protein, and they still have problems with their kidney function. I would then start looking at kind of glutathione status, some antioxidants, which are really useful for the kidneys, particularly alpha lipoic acid, MSM, NAC, and raw glutathione, so actually liposomal glutathione as a supplement sometimes. There's also a very good herbal formula, which is called Rentone. Rentone, it's made up of several different herbs. I can't think off the top of my head exactly what they are, but I've seen that bring up EGFR quite significantly by 30 points or something. One other thing that I would think about is that if someone, and this isn't just any kind of ordinary person, but if someone has a history of consuming very high amounts of dietary oxalate. For instance, green smoothies, copious amounts of dark chocolate, copious amounts of gluten-free grains, or flours like almond flours, lots of nuts, seeds, etc. Very high oxalate foods. I would be concerned, or I maybe honing in onto that, because what you do often see is that as someone is dumping oxalate, then they do go through periods where their GFR drops massively because of the sheer amount of damage that oxalate does to the kidneys. That is usually a temporary thing. So that will kind of fluctuate based on where they are kind of in their cycle and everything. But yeah, the kind of main points I think I've touched on, or what I would usually look for. At the same time, I would also want to try to get someone to have their medical doctor or their primary care physician within the picture, just so that they know what's going on, so that they can investigate. Maybe they'll want to do like a kidney ultrasound or something like that to find out whether the issue is anything more sinister.
Yeah, I actually went to my doctor after I got all the comments from the vegans and got a kidney ultrasound, and they were looking at my blood work and they're like, why are you even here? It's not that bad, because they're so used to seeing things way off the charts. But I was just concerned. What do you think if someone has this type of blood work prolonged? Do you think it's going to lead to an issue if they just get blood work like this and it stays like that and gets, they keep it for a long time? Or do you think it's not going to be a problem?
I think, well, the kidneys are designed to be clearing stuff from the body. If that stuff isn't cleared, then that can cause some kind of damage, right? It's not very good. But at a low level, I mean, the body's pretty resilient, right? So it can deal with a lot for a very long time. When kidney function drops like massively, where it's like 20, then that's a medical emergency kind of thing. I don't like seeing low GFRs, so I always like to try to promote the kind of, I like to get people's doctors on board so that I'm not responsible for guiding them through that, because that can be a medical emergency. It can be something which is something more sinister underlying. But generally, I don't know how to answer your question. I think it's probably not optimal, but I don't think it's going to kill someone if it's ever so slightly on the low side. It's just really you would want it. You want your kidneys working as good as they possibly can be. It's like the liver. You want all of these things working. I don't think it's I don't think it's going to cause any like permanent damage or any serious damage. But over the long term, maybe it does. I'm not sure.
Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah, I know so many people have this, and so I wanted to just cover that, because I know a lot of them are going to say, well, what if I just ignore this? And if I, keep the markers like this for a while? Basically what you're saying is work with your doctor and maybe keep an eye on things, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Look for the root cause. So understandably, if your physician doesn't know, or he's not interested in looking, or he wants to take you off the diet, I mean, it's possible that this diet doesn't work for everyone, right? And that does seem to be the case. But then again, it's also possible that it could be something very simple. It could be dehydration. It could be that you're not consuming enough sodium, you're not having enough potassium, you're not retaining water. And so you're chronically dehydrated. That's really common. It could be that you are, if you've got digestive issues, if you've got chronic diarrhea, for instance, then also you could be chronically dehydrated. If you, you smoke, you drink, you live like an unhealthy lifestyle generally, and you come into contact with a lot of junk, which kind of has a depleting effect on your protective chemicals, the antioxidant system, then again, this is something which could predispose one to developing kidney issues. So it's like, look at all of these factors, reducing protein, playing around with your macros, all the things that we've spoken about. And if it still doesn't improve, I would probably consider, like, if there's no identifiable cause, I'd consider maybe playing around with the diet a little bit more, experiment with maybe adding in some carbohydrates or some fruits or something like that, which take you out of a state where you're primarily relying on meat, on animal protein and on fat, give you a little bit of food elsewhere. And if it improves, then I would say, okay, well, if that works for you, then continue doing that. If someone like, sometimes people become obsessed with one diet, and even when it actually works against them and it's detrimental for them, they want to stick to their guns and follow it through to the end. I don't advise that kind of approach.
Yeah, I agree 100%. 100%. So I guess the next question really comes to gut issues. A lot of people doing carnivore, keto, or low carb diets and just really struggling with gut issues. How do you handle that with clients?
Okay, yeah, good question. So it's really going to depend on when the gut issue started, the history of it. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So if someone comes to me, they say that they have chronic IBS. I mean, if we're looking at kind of, are you talking about autoimmune, so inflammatory bowel diseases, or are you talking about something like IBS, diarrhea, constipation, bloating, that kind of thing?
I think more people are coming into this with like diarrhea, constipation, IBS, like not necessarily the big autoimmune stuff. There are those people, but more commonly I see like loose stools and IBS and bloating and things like that.
Okay. So yeah, so I would kind of screen those people and put them into two categories. I don't like to put people into categories, but sometimes you need to, right? So if someone has had chronic digestive issues before coming into carnivore, which is really common, they have it before coming into carnivore, they go into carnivore and they see that maybe some improves, or that some gets worse, or that it doesn't change. What I am going to be thinking about there, I'm going to be questioning, okay, how long have they been on carnivore? So if it's in the first week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it's not necessarily long enough to actually have a proper, like, to get a proper picture to know whether the diet's even going to work, right? It's like some people, it can take a month for them to even start like properly adapting and seeing benefits. So I would say, okay, if someone has come to me on this diet, they have had chronic digestive issues before going on this diet, and they've been trying this diet for maybe 4 to 6 weeks or even longer, and they still have issues. What I would be asking the question is, okay, right, so if they had this beforehand, then it's possible that what they were dealing with is something which exists in the gut, a kind of environment in the gut, which was there previously, a severe dysbiosis, for instance. So a kind of an imbalance of bacteria. Sometimes there's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So if they have developed a severe overgrowth, a yeast overgrowth, even bacterial overgrowth in the upper small intestine, if they have, let's say you can have pathogenic microbes, you can have what are called genuine pathogens, but then you can also have dysbiotic flora, such as Klebsiella, for instance, which can cause issues for certain people and not others. So I would be considering, okay, do I think that this person has dysbiosis? Do they have some kind of an infection, a GI infection? Do they have sufficient digestive capacity? Because not only are there infections or dysbiosis that we need to consider, we also need to consider things like pancreatic function, things like stomach acid production, things like bile acid synthesis. Okay, these are all really important things. I'll give you the primary reason why is because you can put someone on a really good diet, like a carnivore diet, but if their gut doesn't work properly, then they don't really get that much from the diet. If they can't digest their food, you can put them on any diet. Of course, carnivore diet is probably less inflammatory, but ultimately they're not getting everything they need. So let's say that these people have infections. They may have some kind of a parasite going on. They may have poor pancreatic function. They may have hepatic cholestasis or mild cholestasis, which means that they're not able to generate sufficient amounts of bile, or the composition of the bile is kind of undesirable, let's say. Then any one of these things, or all of these things, some people have all of them, that is going to prevent someone from being able to adapt to a carnivore diet. Okay. And it's like, if they come to you malnourished, like, or they come to you in a state where they're not absorbing nutrients, then putting them on a carnivore diet, I mean, sometimes it can actually make someone worse because meat is quite difficult to digest. I know,
Yes.
you know, people in the carnivore community will say, oh, well, meat's really easy to digest kind of thing, because they give up vegetables and they've got loads of less inflammation and dysbiosis, that they can digest meat really well. But honestly, for the stomach, meat is categorically harder to digest than other foods, let's say, or for the intestine. And what I mean by that is that the bonds holding together dietary protein, like animal protein, if the stomach does not have sufficient pepsin or stomach acid, then people generally don't digest it very well. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, have you ever seen that where people say, well, you know, I just don't digest dietary protein very well?
Oh yeah, I've done a ton of videos. I have a friend of mine who is a kind of a gut expert, and HCl, adding that in and adding enzymes in has made such a world of difference for so many people I've worked with, and for myself as well. It's like night and day. Like without the HCl and enzymes, I'm a lot more hungry. I'm a lot more tired, and I'm convinced that I was not absorbing the nutrients from the meat, you know, which is supposed to be the easiest thing in the world to digest, but I just wasn't absorbing the nutrients. And so I found I was overeating more, and then I would be more tired. And it was just like this vicious cycle, and just adding in those digestive supports for me made a huge difference. And I've seen it work for a lot of people as well. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. That I think that's something that doesn't necessarily get as much attention as it deserves. It's like assuming that someone, because there are some people who come from a standard diet and then they move over to a carnivore diet and they adapt perfectly because they can properly take what they need to from the meat. But there's a lot of people who don't, they're not like the success stories, so to speak. You know, you don't see them on the memes or on the videos or on the testimonials, but there's lots of people who've been very sick with other conditions. You know, maybe you talk about chronic fatigue syndrome or Lyme disease or other, you know, more complex conditions, and they come to the carnivore diet and actually they find it so difficult because they can't digest the food. And so, first, what I would be looking at is probably some testing in this regard. So I do stool testing for these kinds of people. Generally, if someone's got gut issues, I don't really test all that much. But when someone has been on a carnivore diet, I want to rule out some kind of a bacterial infection, some kind of a parasitic infection. So I'll be looking at something like a GI map or one of the other stool tests, which is not 100% accurate, but can give some pretty good indication whether there's any intestinal inflammation, for instance. You know, it might be that this person does have an inflammatory bowel disease and they don't know about it. There could be kind of lots of things behind this. So a good quality stool test is going to tell you whether there's any major inflammation, whether there's significant kind of immune response down in the gut, whether there is sufficient digestive capacity to some extent, and whether there's any issues with kind of fat malabsorption. Okay. Yeah. At the same time, it will tell you whether there's any kind of an infection. So that's what I would like to do with these kinds of people. Sometimes you might do a stool test and you find it comes back completely clean. So then I am looking at, okay, is it a problem with the hardware, as in the actual cells which make up the digestive system, rather than a problem with the gut microbes? So, you know, in the functional medicine, alternative health community, they're all focused on the microbiome. You know, it's all about kill off this bacteria, kill off this parasite, boost these bacteria, you know, take probiotics, take prebiotics, all this kind of stuff. But many times people come to me, they've already done that stuff and it doesn't necessarily work. So there I'm looking at, okay, is there a problem with the actual machinery of the gut? So for instance, the stomach, well, we know that you need zinc to make stomach acid. We know that you need vitamin B1 to make stomach acid. We know that you need B1 to propel or a functioning nervous system, autonomic nervous system, to propel food throughout the GI tract, to release the digestive enzymes, for the pancreas to function properly, for the liver to be generating enough bile. Okay. So what we would be doing there is honing in on the symptoms. We say, okay, so if someone has a typical or classical symptoms of, say, hypochlorhydria, which is low stomach acid, that is fairly obvious pretty early on, because someone will eat and within a couple of minutes, they might feel bloated in the upper abdomen, so around where the stomach is. They might start burping or belching. They might feel as though food sits in the stomach for a long period of time. So for people like that, well, the chances are they're not going to be breaking apart their protein, and therefore every next stage of digestion is probably not going to work as well as it should be. And therefore these people are likely going to remain malnourished to some extent until they fix the problem. So kind of, if I think it's a stomach acid problem, then not only would I be prescribing stomach acid, digestive enzymes, pepsin, etc., I would also be trying to answer the question, why is there low stomach acid in the first place? A lot of times what I find is it's actually a problem with the autonomic nervous system. So generally a problem with these kinds of people, not only will they have problems with low stomach acid, sometimes they have problems with constipation, or they have gastroparesis, or they have other autonomic nervous system problems as well, maybe some kind of neuropathy. So I would be doing a workup to try get a, as much of a picture, or as most complete as a picture of a picture as possible, and hone in on which kind of part of the digestive system isn't working, or all of it, if it is that case. We've spoken about stomach acid, but say if it is, could it be underlying intestinal permeability, which was there previously and remains there? If that's the case, then trying to address intestinal permeability, there's lots of natural therapies and stuff to do that. We don't necessarily need to go through exactly what that is, but there's lots, glutamine, aloe, all of this kind of stuff. And basically, sometimes just addressing intestinal permeability can kind of rebalance what's going on down in the intestine, and you find that someone starts digesting their food a little bit better. Okay, in the case that it is the liver, an example might be that if someone has pale stools, this is really common. They go from a low-fat diet, they come onto a high-fat diet, and all of a sudden they start developing very, very pale stools. They might have feelings of kind of congestion or swelling around their liver. They might get very nauseous after consuming fat. They might have kind of severe abdominal pain after consuming fat, either pale stools, or they could have severe diarrhea as well. In this kind of situation, I'm going to say, well, it's probably not the stomach. It's probably not the pancreas or the intestine itself per se. It likely has to do with either liver or liver and gallbladder. And so in that case, we're going to focus heavily on providing all of the nutrition necessary to generate bile acids, use preformed bile acids, use TUDCA, which is taurouracil deoxycholic acid, type of bile acid. We'll be using all of the different tools that we have, especially this is where I would be adding specific bitter herbs as well, artichoke extract, gentian, dandelion, a lot of the plants which can stimulate gallbladder activity. So we're going to be kind of, using our armory to provide the liver with what it needs to stimulate bile acid production and bile flow, but also giving the gallbladder the stimulus to actually flush that out into the digestive tract. Now, those are the main things that I will be focusing on. They're usually the most common things. If someone has like chronic diarrhea, someone has constipation, they get bloating, that kind of stuff, it's usually addressed by one of those kind of approaches. So stomach, assess what's going on in the stomach, assess what's going on in the intestine, assess liver, gallbladder. Okay. However, what you'll sometimes find is that people didn't come on the carnivore diet because they had digestive issues. They came on the carnivore diet because they had some other problem. And then all of a sudden they started developing very severe digestive issues after starting carnivore. Have you seen that?
Oh, yes, definitely. Absolutely.
Okay. So this is a little bit of a conundrum because people kind of think they've been shortchanged because they start on the carnivore diet, they hear all the benefits, and then all of a sudden they've got severe watery diarrhea for sometimes weeks on end, or severe constipation. So what I would do in this situation is I would give it time, first of all. Now, if it's diarrhea, I would give it time. I would say, okay, give it a month maximum. I don't want to go any more than a month. In that time, I want to make sure that you're drinking sufficient amounts of salt in your water, possibly an electrolyte mix, because you're going to be losing a lot of stuff through diarrhea. So we want to make sure that you're hydrated, but we want to give you around a month, because sometimes it seems as though this is the kind of most common reaction that many people find. They have this adaptation period. They get diarrhea for a couple of weeks. It's almost like the microbiome or the gut bugs are trying to adapt to having no, starch, none of the plant fibers, and all of the fat. So it does take a while for the body to adapt. And I usually make sure that they kind of understand that before telling them to go on the diet, or, they anticipate that. If it's constipation, I take a little bit more of an aggressive approach. I will prescribe some kind of a laxative. So that will be either higher amounts of magnesium citrate. It might be a type of oxymagnesium, or it might be a herb such as triphala. And that is really, I'm more concerned about stuff sitting in the GI tract for a long period of time, because we have reabsorption of toxins and things. I don't like that. I prefer to see diarrhea than I would constipation. So I do something about constipation. I don't really do anything other than optimizing electrolytes and hydration with someone who's got diarrhea. Now, if they've done the diarrhea thing and they've gone on carnivore, they have diarrhea for about 4 weeks, anything above that, I'm starting to get concerned, because then I'm saying, right, okay, well, this person is seeing no benefit whatsoever. What is the problem? So does it come back to what we were thinking before? Is it that, okay, there is an issue with digestion? Either they don't have the pancreatic function to generate the lipase, either they do not have, bile, then there's not sufficient bile. Is it some kind of an insufficiency or a weakness in digestion? Many times, sometimes it is. I find more often it's actually not. So in some of the cases, for instance, I posted a video on YouTube a couple years ago, and that was after some research that I'd done for a client, which was an individual who had chronic diarrhea for a long time. You're talking several months. Now, I've had quite a few clients who have presented with this issue, and in this case, I did a bit of research. It turns out that what the literature indicates is that sometimes it's not a digestive insufficiency. It can be actually an excess of bile acids. So if you go on the forums or whatever, they might tell you that you need to take ox bile or tudka or something like that, which is bile acid replacement, because bile is meant to emulsify fat and allow you to absorb it and digest it. Generally, excess fat is associated with diarrhea. So the logic goes that if you take ox bile, it can help you digest fat and you no longer get the diarrhea. Now, in some people, that is the case. However, in many people, it makes them significantly worse. So in these kinds of individuals, sometimes it can be that they've got excess bile. And in those cases, without going too much into the details, there's some things that I have people do which can reduce the amount of bile that someone's making through improving an axis, but basically improving the communication between the gut and the liver. So I might use quite a high dose of vitamin C for this. So I would go up kind of 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams per day. I found in many people 1,500 milligrams will stop the diarrhea very quickly. In some people, the herb berberine, milk thistle, these two herbs work very well. And in some people, calcium supplements can help as well. I think there's various reasons why that might be. So in some people, chronic diarrhea can be what's called bile acid malabsorption. They've got too much bile. I've got a video on all the mechanisms if people want to listen to that. It's on my YouTube channel, and the kind of therapies that I use for that. That oftentimes responds well to those kind of things. Sometimes what you might find is that someone goes on a carnivore diet, they go through a honeymoon period, they have really good digestion for say 3 weeks or 2 months or 6 months. And then all of a sudden they might start developing cyclical diarrhea. Okay, and this might present maybe once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week. It might present kind of at much longer intervals. So maybe once every 2 weeks or once every 3 weeks. And oftentimes these people, they do have a history of consuming copious amounts of high oxalate foods. That's one thing. And that's something that I often do in my case history is work out, okay, does this person have like this high oxalate phenotype? Have they gone through periods of consuming massive amounts of these foods? And if that's the case, what you often find, and it never fails to amaze me, is that for people, it usually presents as diarrhea, people who have this cyclical diarrhea, or even they have chronic diarrhea, consuming some high oxalate food, okay? Usually that is going to fix the problem within well, less than 24 hours, within 12 hours usually. Okay. So I've had some people who've had very severe chronic diarrhea for, 6 months after going on a carnivore diet. Okay. And that is, go to the toilet 4, 5, 6 times every single day, and it's complete liquid. Okay, no formation whatsoever. Now, in these individuals, if it is caused by oxalate, generally having 3 to 4 pieces of dark chocolate, maybe a handful of almonds, maybe drinking some green tea, you want to make sure that you reach maybe 50 to 100 milligrams of oxalate. Usually, the diarrhea will stop almost immediately. Okay, and I've seen this on so many occasions that if someone has done everything they can do for digestion, then they've done worked on the leaky gut stuff. They've assessed intestinal infections, inflammation. They've tried a bunch of different stuff, and they still have chronic digestive issues such as diarrhea. Then I would be going immediately for the high oxalate foods. Not too much, but just using them as a tool. And then what you often find is that if the diarrhea stops, then what that tells you is that it's probably a way for the body to rapidly dump excessive amounts of oxalate through the gut. And in that kind of situation, then you'd if I was in someone's position, what I would be looking to do is gradually reducing the oxalate that I'm having every day and finding a maintenance dose, one that stops me from having diarrhea, but one which is not anywhere much higher than 50 milligrams per day. And again, that's usually just a couple squares of dark chocolate or something like that. So that's what I would look at for digestive issues primarily. It's less common that you see infections, but of course it can be the case.
Yeah. And I guess not totally on the same line, but histamine. This is a thing I'm seeing that people are dealing with. They'll do carnivore for a while. I did it for about a year, and that's when I started having all of a sudden histamine problems. And I'd had histamine growing up. I always had eczema and was very sensitive to histamine. And then it kind of had gone away. Going carnivore, I had this honeymoon period of a year, and I was like, oh, it's cured. And then it came back even worse than before. And I've had to do a lot to deal with histamine. Now I can eat avocado and drink bone broth and I'm fine, and eat leftovers. But I see this actually happening quite a bit with people that do a carnivore diet. What are your thoughts on that? And how would you help someone that has histamine issues?
Okay, another rabbit hole.
I know.
Without going into too much detail, right. It depends what you mean by histamine intolerance or histamine issues, because it's like a spectrum. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We have someone with a little bit excess histamine and, getting a runny nose or getting a bit flushed, getting a bit sweaty, a bit of a headache, feeling a bit dizzy. And then we have mast cell activation syndrome. Okay. And that is the end of the spectrum. Now, mast cell activation syndrome is oftentimes it's an entirely different animal. I don't believe it falls under the same category as histamine intolerance, but some people, if they've got MCAS, then they identify as having histamine intolerance. I would say that they're parts of a spectrum, but oftentimes the MCAS usually has a much more sinister cause. Okay, so people who have very extreme severe histamine reactions at the slightest amount of histamine, and sometimes even when there's other triggers, it's not even just histamine, but their mast cells are just releasing copious amounts of histamine all the time. These people, oftentimes, they have underlying mold issues, so issues with their environmental mold exposure, oftentimes in their house. Sometimes it can be a past issue. They have some kind of a systemic infection, whether it be Lyme disease, Babesia, Bartonella, one of the kind of stealth hidden infections that can evade the immune system, or something like that. So I would say I'd put them away at the moment, because for the majority of people, histamine intolerance is the runny nose, is the headache, is the feeling a bit tired.
Heart palpitations.
This kind of heart palpitations, of course. So with this issue, again, it's like going at it with as a detective. We want to first of all understand all of the things, or the majority of things, which can cause histamine intolerance. Okay, because we all have high amounts of histamine, or we all have a good amount of histamine. We're releasing it all the time. It's part of our immune system. It's actually beneficial in a variety of ways. We need histamine to generate stomach acid. Okay, so actually, it's like why do some people have a difficulty. Why do some people make excess? That's one question. A second question is why can some people not get rid of it as fast as others? Okay, so we need to consider these two different things, because generally histamine intolerance is either a problem that they have too much of it being made, or alternatively, it's an issue that they can't clear it, they can't detoxify it, they can't inactivate it. Okay, so on a carnivore diet, why might someone have an issue with histamine? First of all, I would be looking primarily at nutrients. Okay, at the nutrients that they are taking in through their diet, whether they have sufficient minerals, whether they have sufficient B vitamins, etc. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Right. First of all, if someone's on a carnivore diet and they eat a predominantly muscle meat based diet, then what they are going to be getting high amounts of is zinc, and they're likely not going to be getting much copper. Okay. So if that goes on for a long enough period of time, you can get a bit of a zinc dominance and a copper. The two minerals, they act as an antagonistic pair. So when you have high amounts of one, it can deplete the other. When you have high amounts of another, it can deplete the other. They kind of work together, but also at odds with each other. So someone who's on a very high zinc diet and quite a low copper diet, if they are not consuming organ meat, liver is one of the best forms of copper in the diet. If someone's not consuming organs, yet they're consuming lots of muscles, it's pretty easy to develop an imbalance. So the enzymes which are involved in breaking down histamine require copper as a cofactor. Okay. So if we do not have enough copper, then we can't break down histamine, and therefore it's an issue of clearance. Okay. So what I'm going to be looking at is a plasma minerals panel, or looking at plasma zinc, serum copper or plasma copper, and maybe some of the other minerals, but it's primarily going to be looking at the balance between zinc and copper. So sometimes it can be as simple as, if someone has high zinc, they have low copper, start to consume organ meats, continue with the muscle meats, but actually supplement with a form of copper, such as a copper glycinate. Okay, they might go 2 to 4 milligrams per day for a month and then retest. Okay, that's what I'd be looking at on the minerals front. On the vitamins front, again, similar kind of concept. So one of the ways in which we are clearing histamine is via an enzyme called HNMT, and this requires SAMe, which is generated through methylation, or it's what's called our primary methyl donor. So if your listeners are familiar with the concept of methylation, it's just basically a process which goes on in our cells and which we use for lots of weird and wonderful stuff. So basically, you need good methylation to be able to clear or inactivate histamine via this HNMT enzyme. Okay, if someone does not have sufficient levels of folate, if they don't have sufficient levels of magnesium, if they don't have sufficient levels of choline, if they don't have, I mean, there's numerous nutrients which could potentially get low on a carnivore diet depending on someone's genetics. But basically, if they don't have the nutrients necessary for recycling homocysteine back to methionine, basically through running around this methylation process, then the chances are they're going to be less likely to be able to clear histamine from their body. And there we see another issue with clearance. Thirdly, and let me know if I'm kind of going too deep into it or if I'm just talking for too long. I don't want to bore you listeners. Hey, I don't want to bore you listeners. It's just there's like so many things that can be involved here. So thirdly, on a carnivore diet specifically, I am massively concerned with vitamin C status. Okay. And that's because over the years that I've been consulting with people on a carnivore diet, well, I've seen plasma vitamin C and some other functional markers for vitamin C status be pretty low. Now, what I will say is that I've got a bit of you wouldn't call it biased, but my sample size is not necessarily reflective of everyone, because I get people who are like sick, who have underlying health issues. So one could make an argument that their antioxidant levels and things are going to be lower than the average person. And that's fair enough. But all I can say is that what I've seen is that vitamin C can and does tend to be a problem for some people on a carnivore diet. And one of the reasons I think for this is because, our environment is I mean, our environment is pretty toxic, right? You can do everything that you can physically do to try to minimize the toxicity that you're exposed to. But quite frankly, the fact that we're sat here indoors on a computer, touching plastics, leaving the house, breathing in exhaust fumes, we come into contact with how many thousands of toxins every single day. So ultimately, we have a bit of an increased burden in our modern environment, I would say, and that's not factoring in EMFs, all of this other stuff, which can basically place a burden. And so that burden, one of the things that is doing is increasing our requirement for vitamin C and the other antioxidants. Now, what I've seen in many cases is that carnivores tend to have low levels of vitamin C. One of the ways that you can identify this, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but I think this is a fairly important point, and I do like to try to emphasize it when I can, is that when someone has poor vitamin C status, one of the first symptoms, in fact, one study showed, one of the first symptoms that showed up, like the first symptom of a mild vitamin C deficiency, it was histamine intolerance. Okay. So vitamin C is the level of vitamin C in the blood is inversely correlated with the level of histamine. Okay. Vitamin C increases the activity of the enzyme DAO, diamine oxidase, which inactivates histamine, breaks histamine down. Okay. And that low levels of vitamin C, you end up with lower amounts of diamine oxidase in the blood, and vitamin C, it seems, also appears to have like a directly inactivating effect on histamine when it comes into contact with it, kind of without the action of any enzymes. So what I'm saying is that vitamin C and histamine are like worst enemies. Okay, but vitamin C is the good guy in this story, and histamine is the bad guy. So in this case, what I've found is that actually the histamine intolerant symptoms can, in many cases, simply be a subclinical or a mild deficiency of vitamin C. Some of the other signs and symptoms that you might see from someone is if they have dry skin, if they end up with bleeding gums. That's really common. So people go on a carnivore diet, they feel good for 12 months. All of a sudden, they start developing bleeding gums. They might have dry skin around their nails. They might have brittle nails. See, vitamin C is necessary for how our body cross-links collagen. Now, collagen, you can get as much collagen as you want in the diet. That's excellent. You can get all the amino acids. But if you don't have enough vitamin C, then you can't properly incorporate that collagen into your own tissue. And so what ends up happening is that the collagen network breaks down. And in that case, you end up with kind of bleeding, or you might end up with broken blood vessels or veins, which are a little bit more visible, or kind of, they're called petechias, where you end up with like small red broken blood vessels under the skin, corkscrew hairs, for instance. So again, there's some pretty like classic signs and symptoms of vitamin C deficiency. And another one can also be fatigue. There's an argument to be made that it's important for the adrenal glands as well. But overall, I would say that is a key driver of histamine intolerance in a carnivore. Secondly, okay, so what have we spoken about? We've spoken about zinc, copper. We've spoken about methylation. We spoke B6 is really important. So again, B6 is not usually low on a carnivore diet, but I have to mention that. Vitamin C, sometimes if they have underlying gut issues, then sometimes it can be actually excess histamine, which is generated via the gut bacteria. There are some pretty good probiotics which can kind of counteract that effect. There's one by a company called Seeking Health by Ben Lynch. It's called Probiotic Histamine X. That is usually pretty beneficial. What I would usually use is, here we're talking about the underlying causes, like nutritionally speaking. So if someone has, if they have any of these imbalances, then no matter what you do to the gut microbes, or, you take certain polyphenols, which can help reduce histamine and things, it's not really going to, it's going to be putting a Band-Aid on it. It's going to be symptom management, because if the cause is nutritional deficiency or an excess, then that's going to be the way that you're going to fix that. But again, if it is coming through the gut, or if someone does have intestinal permeability, for instance, then histamine generated in the gut can get into the blood in much higher amounts than than would be otherwise, and therefore someone can actually less of a problem with clearance of histamine. It might be that they've just got so much coming in that they can't process it, they can't physiologically process it. So trying to address if there is anything going on in the gut, try to identify that. If there is any kind of underlying infection, sometimes staph or strep, that can be associated with histamine intolerance. So again, looking in that direction, but that's not usually the first place I would look. Usually the first place I would look is some of the key, primarily methylation, copper, vitamin C, B6, maybe some of the other B vitamins. But overall, that's the kind of thing that I would be looking at for in histamine intolerance. Now, in some people, nearly done. In some people, what will happen is that they will try all of those things and they still do not see any improvement whatsoever. Now, in that case, it could be that they are having some kind of an allergy to a food that they're eating. For instance, some of the key foods that I find people being allergic to is eggs and dairy, right?
Yeah.
Commonly looking at food IgG panel, I don't know if you run those, but egg white is the single most common protein that I see across the board that people cannot tolerate or that they have an immunological reaction to. So if they're having a food intolerance, and this also relates to one of your previous questions, a problem with the gut. If they've got a problem with digestion, this is something we haven't spoken about, but that actually is really important, is looking if they have any immune reactions against foods. So usually that is eggs. Sometimes it's egg yolks. Usually it's egg white. Usually it's dairy protein. Sometimes it's lactose. Sometimes it's types of meats, chicken, etc. But I see that way less commonly. So what I would say is that if something is triggering their immune system, and it might not be food as well, it could be mold, could be some kind of an allergen that they're coming into contact with, could be some kind of spice. If they're coming into contact with something which is stimulating their immune system, they're going to be generating higher amounts of histamine anyway, because it's part of the immune response. Now, if you do all that basic stuff and then you can't find what the problem is, and actually you find that you're someone with severe histamine intolerance, chances are you've probably got mast cell activation disorder. And if that's the case, or mast cell activation syndrome, MCAS, chances are there's something much deeper, which is aggravating or stimulating the immune response, which is not going to be fixed by the traditional kind of histamine reducing remedies. Some people, rightly so, they will freeze their food immediately upon getting it. They won't eat leftover food. They won't, they'll watch how they're cooking their food and things. But overall, it's very much symptom management, because fundamentally there is a cause, and the majority of people, myself included, have zero problem with eating leftover food, with eating slow cooked food, so there's a reason biochemically, there's a biochemical defect somewhere, or some kind of an imbalance, which kind of needs to be investigated.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a difference between mast cell and just regular histamine. I guess one more question I had kind of on the same gut line is, do you think the carnivore diet is bad for the gut microbiome? There's so much talk about gut microbiome now. And do you think it's bad for people long term, or do you think people would be fine as long as they added in like some fermented foods and possibly a little bit of supplementation?
Yeah, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question, and the reason is I question whether anyone is, I really agree with Sean Baker on this one. And I have done for several years, actually. Is there anyone who talks about how you need to eat this specific kind of food, because otherwise you'll get an unhealthy microbiome, and therefore you will be increase the likelihood of developing all these diseases? They're based usually on like observational data, and the data is like not very good at this current moment in time. Like, what they'll do is they'll look at populations, and then they'll look at like the type of species that they have in the gut. Again, is based on a pretty myopic view, or let's say a reductionistic view, that one, it's only food that you're eating which is governing what grows in your gut in terms of the microbiome, because that could not be further from the truth. In fact, there's some pretty interesting research which would highlight that actually the environment, so the light environment, the timing of daylight exposure, the
Yes.
UV index, all of this stuff is actually like a primary determinant, if not one of the primary determinants of the kind of microbes. There's also like just because a particular bacteria grows in a healthy population, does that mean that that is applicable to someone halfway across the world? I'll be honest, like, I don't know either way. I think it's really interesting and it's cool. And by all means, if someone like uses a bacteria and it helps them improve their health, then that's great. I recommend probiotics. I find that probiotics are excellent in some people. Don't really make that much of a difference in other people.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm not going to get hung up on bacteria. Frankly, I don't care. You know, if someone comes to me and they've got like, I mean, numerous people who've come to me with Crohn's disease, for instance, it's like a very severe condition. In fact, if it gets bad enough, then people have to have like bowel resection and have colostomy bag for the rest of their life. So this is a really severe autoimmune condition. And if they see improvements and they achieve clinical remission, which they oftentimes do, with a diet which is very high in supposed food, which supposedly is not compatible with these supposedly healthy bacteria, frankly, like, I couldn't care less. You know, if they are in a situation where they're not chronically inflamed, where they're not where they've not got GI bleeding, where they've got solid consistent digestion, when they're not in pain, like, to me, that's healthy digestion. Like, maybe in 20 years or so, it will be different. Maybe they will say that you need to inoculate yourself with like a bacteria. But I don't think that's going to happen. And if it does, then, you know, I'll eat my hat kind of thing. I'm happy to be wrong about that. I just figure that, you know, I agree with Sean Baker on this. You know, if someone's stool looks good and they haven't got any issues with their digestion, then generally, you know, it's a fairly good indication that they have good digestion, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I've been down the rabbit hole this year of just trying to understand gut microbiome. I've had different experts on from different sides of the fence. And what I kind of understand, I don't know if you agree with me on this, is just like the science is so young. We just don't really know a whole lot. And it seems like there's a new study that comes out every week that says something different. You know, there was one just about a month ago that said, you know, fiber could actually make the gut microbiome worse and we should just stick to fermented foods. And it's just the information just keeps changing. So for someone to say you can't do it, you have to have these specific foods and all these fibers and things in order to have a healthy gut microbiome, I just don't think that there's evidence for that yet, honestly.
Yeah, indeed. And there's some literature indicating that the composition of the microbes is actually in many cases is reflective or is determined or is influenced by the health of the cells, right? So your intestinal cells will be metabolizing energy and they'll be releasing chemicals. Okay, so there was one study which showed, like, I think it was the amount of nitric oxide or the amount of nitrate or some other gaseous compound, and then some other signaling molecules and some other chemicals which were actually produced by the intestinal cells themselves. That was like one of the things which modulated what grew and what didn't grow in the intestine. So, you know, there's a line of thinking which I think is among some of the research community looking into this stuff. Well, they would say, okay, maybe you know, there's clearly like a cross talk between the human body and the bacteria, but at the same time, perhaps what's going on in the human body is a lot more important at governing what grows. You know, it's kind of like the germ terrain theory. It's like, if the terrain is healthy, then that's gonna determine like the composition of the bugs, right? Whereas if someone's terrain is unhealthy, then you may develop kind of like an underlying dysbiosis. I mean, there was one case, I'm pretty sure there was an individual, there's probably several of them now, who were eating high fiber diets and did a stool microbiome test and discovered that they had very low levels of these supposed fiber fermenters. And yet they went on a carnivore diet for 6 months or something, did another test, and they've all of a sudden got very high levels of like lactobacillus and bifidobacter, which is supposedly, which need fiber, right? So it's
Right,
like,
right.
well, how did they get there? And you can make the argument, okay, well, it's not technically fiber that they need. They need these like prebiotics, and prebiotics is a wider categorization that might actually apply to the protein found in collagen, for instance. So insects, and even like the collagen found in like in animal connective tissue, collagen powder, perhaps that actually plays a role as a significant prebiotic. So it might be the case that actually the researchers are pretty narrowly focused on looking at like plant-based fibers, which improve the growth of these bugs. But actually, you know, it could be the case that there's lots of things that that can actually provide sustenance for these kind of microbes. And again, I think the proof is in the pudding, you know.
Yeah.
And there seems to be Weston A. Price. He documented several cases. I'm sure you've heard this to death, but overall, you know, there's many indigenous populations, at least there was, who survived primarily on animal products and may have had some fiber, but very little fiber. And they seem to do fairly well in terms of the health. So I think to reduce health down to like a couple of bugs which live in the gut or around the gut or whatever, it seems a little bit too simplistic for my liking.
I completely agree 100%. So thank you. Yeah, that's great. Awesome. I guess one more question, because I feel like we could probably talk a lot longer, but I know we both have schedules and things. Case for supplementation. We've talked a lot about different supplementation protocols that you would use with people, but just in general, I think a lot of people come to carnivore and say, I don't need a supplement. I think it's stupid. It's bad. I shouldn't do it. What cases, maybe besides some of the ones that we've already talked about, would you say that someone needs to have supplements on a carnivore diet?
Okay. I'll just preface this with every single carnivore that comes to me, I will be putting them on supplements. Okay. Because the reason they come to me is because the diet didn't work alone. Okay. If someone comes to me and they pay my fee and they say, I don't want to have any supplements, I'll say, okay, I probably can't help you, you know? And I'm that strict on it. And the reason is because the way that I look at it, it's really quite simple, is that an unnatural, what's the word? Natural means call for natural measures. I've forgotten the phrase, but basically the fact that we live in a pretty unnatural environment right now justifies using unnatural measures to try to improve or regain health. Okay. Now that is not to say that people need supplements like across the board. Okay.
Right.
That's not to in any way discount that thousands or millions at this point who have probably achieved major health benefits through diet alone, major health benefits through doing a carnivore diet alone. That's amazing. If someone can do that, that's great. The only thing I would say is that they're generally not the people who are going to come to me. Okay. Right. The people who come to me are the ones who usually had underlying very severe health conditions for a long time before going on carnivore diet. They went on the carnivore diet because they thought that it would help. It may have helped slightly, but it's not fixed them. They've tried everything else. They've tried every diet. They've tried a lot of other things, and that's like carnivore is like the end of the road for them. So they've done it. It didn't fix them. It didn't take them to the next level. They're still kind of relatively unhealthy, let's say. And they're kind of, what's the word? They don't know where to go from here. Yeah. So in that kind of situation, what I would say is the case for supplementation is for people whose bodies have been insulted through decades long, modern living, right? Yeah. So we have the toxins, we have the radiation, we have the nutrient depleted diets, we have chronic nutritional deficiencies which develop on these kind of diets. Yes. Now, these kind of problems, they don't resolve overnight. And what you'll find is I have a lot of people who have underlying deficiencies or metabolic imbalances, which have been there for, say, 3 years or a couple of years. And then they go on a carnivore diet, but the diet alone is not enough to fix the imbalance. Sometimes if the environment is so skewed or so imbalanced in the body, then it really requires some kind of intervention to bring things back into balance. Now, when they're back in balance, then you can go on and you can remove supplements. You can try to get everything that you need from the diet. But using the kind of example that we spoke about previously, with the gut, if your gut is not working properly, then you're not getting, even if you eat the same meal as someone whose gut is functioning, you are not deriving the nutrition that they are. That's really, really important to understand, is that, just because you're eating the same thing does not mean that you're absorbing the same thing.
Yes.
And so you can have this issue, which is referred to the researchers in the field of looking at thiamine, vitamin B1, which is one of my primary focuses at the moment, is looking at this condition, or what they refer to as malnutrition-induced malnutrition. So what that basically means is that malnutrition or deficiency in one vitamin or more vitamins or a mineral, for instance, because of what happens as a consequence of that deficiency, they become deficient in multiple others across the board. And so what you often see is that people who go through long periods of time, say they're diabetic, say they've been on God knows what medications, which are known to deplete some of the B vitamins, inhibit the absorption of certain minerals, cause toxicity, etc. And they've been on a standard diet with high sugar, high refined carbohydrates, low animal proteins, low animal fats. They are at least deficient in a couple of different things, or massively insufficient, let's say. Deficiency, it's basically semantics. So we'll call it insufficient. What is going to happen is that they are going to have metabolic adaptations. So certain things in their body are going to slow down, certain processes. So to give you an example, the rate at which our mitochondria is making energy can slow down when we have these insufficiencies. The rate at which our digestive function works slows down during these deficiencies. And so if I have someone, I'll give you a classical example, is why a lot of people get in contact with me these days, is if they have underlying thiamine deficiency, what ends up happening is that they lose the capacity to digest their food. So any diet that they're put on, they cannot absorb it. So in that kind of situation, we need to be looking at the cause, and we need to say, okay, so what we need to do is we need to address all of the things that are stopping you from absorbing and utilizing the animal-based diet, and then you can go on the animal-based diet without any supplements. So that might be digestive support. That might even be some kind of a regime. If there's someone who I think is particularly affected by environmental toxins and things, it might be that they need to undertake some kind of detoxification protocols. They might need extensive testing, supplementation, looking at what's going on at the cellular level. If they have, here's another thing as well, is that if someone has defective mitochondria, so someone has, some kind of a drug reaction, a toxic reaction, they have damage to their mitochondria, then it's going to be a case that these people are not only going to kind of need to supplement things to improve their mitochondrial function, but it might be the case that they need to get to a point where they clear out all the dead mitochondria and build up new ones. So that might be a case of targeted fasted protocols. It might be the case of, kind of taking it a lot slower. It might be that their mitochondria are so screwed that they can't burn fat for energy. And so someone might not even be appropriate for a carnivore diet. It might be that their ability to burn fat is so compromised at the minute that they need to take it way slower. They need to go back to like a more balanced protocol, and we need to try to support their ability to digest fat, to absorb fat, and to actually utilize it at the cellular level. Things like carnitine, vitamin B2, riboflavin, biotin, any of the other kind of nutrients that you need for your mitochondria to burn a fuel. It can be the case that if they're deficient in that, any diet that they're going to take is going to be incompatible with them, or is not going to suit them. So overall, what I would say is that we need to kind of acknowledge the benefits of this as a diet for a relatively healthy person who's not been too damaged by our world. But at the same time, there's people who come into this with damaged machinery. And what we need to do is try to fix their machinery before they can derive the full benefits from that. And this kind of relates to one of the other questions that you put down, but I'm not sure if you've got time for, but you'd asked sorry, which question are we on? Yeah, there's what are the most common issues that I see for people on a carnivore diet?
Yes. Yeah, we can do that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So oftentimes the most common issues we've spoken about a couple of those. One is going to be the digestion, and that's, you know, it can be long term or it can be short term. Like only since they've been on carnivore, we've spoken about the kind of things that you might want to look at or someone might want to consider when they're thinking about digestive issues on carnivore. Secondly, it might be an issue. Another really resistant issue that I find is thyroid issues. Okay,
Yes.
particularly for women. So if a female is on a ketogenic diet because they want to lose weight or they want to improve their autoimmune condition or something, they go on to carnivore. One of the things which I find doesn't improve frequently is thyroid issues.
Yeah, the
Problems.
T3 being low is the thing that I see the most. Yeah. But a
Yeah.
lot of people say that that's not problematic, the T3 being low, because there's no symptoms that are accompanying it. They are no cold hands and feet. They have thick hair. Everything's working fine, but the T3 shows up low on blood tests.
Yeah, that's assuming that they don't have any of the symptoms, right?
Yeah.
There are also people who do have the symptoms. Now, there's this like low T3 kind of bizarre thing that many people on carnivore do get, right? And I'm not saying that that's pathologic or pathogenic kind of thing. It's probably not an issue. That being said, in some cases, it is an issue. And in some cases, the thyroid is non-responsive. Like, for instance, if they have Hashimoto's, then sometimes the carnivore diet doesn't address that. If they have autoimmunity of the thyroid, like you would think that, okay, addressing the gut and taking out the allergens and things, that's going to address the thyroid problem. But sometimes if the autoimmunity is driven by something other than food, then carnivore doesn't always like address that. Right. You know, sometimes it can be, say, an underlying, again, coming back to the gut, H. pylori infection underlying that can drive
Hashimoto's,
thyroid antibodies.
Yeah.
It can be underlying EBV reactivation, although there's usually other symptoms. But sometimes I'm at a loss with regard to what to do with some females who've tried basically everything. They cannot lose weight. They have underlying thyroid issues, and in some cases, like especially if they've been on a ketogenic diet for a long period of time. Like I'm a bit of a heretic here, but I will say, like, okay, let's get you eating some carbohydrates, you know?
Yeah.
And in some cases, I've seen it actually resolve or improve the thyroid related stuff. Now, in that case, I usually refer someone. I try to get them to find an integrative doctor or, you know, functional medicine doctor who can prescribe something like natural desiccated thyroid. There's a very good product by like Ancestral Supplements or some other kind of thyroid glandular. Sometimes that can help if there's no Hashimoto's. I'm a little bit concerned if there is Hashimoto's, because sometimes you can get a cross reaction with the food that they eat because it's a kind of similar protein. Overall, that is something very common that I see. And really with the endocrine stuff, the hormone stuff, I tend to refer those people on if I'm at the end of my road and I don't know what to do with that kind of thing. Another thing that I do find quite frequently that doesn't necessarily respond to the carnivore diet all that well is underlying hormonal issues for females. So that might be severe estrogen dominance, it may be progesterone deficiency, it may be hyperprolactinemia. All of these different things I tend to find that they're less responsive. Although many people do respond, I deal with quite a few people who I still refer on to getting bioidentical hormone therapy, and then they see improvements. Again, those are two things which I see quite frequently, but I don't touch all that much. That being said, what I do see very frequently is underlying neurological issues, in fact. So typically this might present as balance issues, dizziness, neuropathy, which may develop later into being on a carnivore diet, particularly those who have chronic digestive issues on a carnivore diet. Where what we have to factor in is that the foods that we eat on carnivore are generally not fortified. And so although fortification has its downsides, like even if someone eats junk, if they're absorbing it and digesting it and stuff, then the chances are they're getting they're getting the nutrients that are fortified in the food.
Right.
With carnivore, if someone has a real issue with digesting the food, it can be quite ripe for them developing deficiencies. I see quite commonly thiamine, vitamin B1 to be very commonly low in people who have issues which present in the neurological system. If they're developing neuropathy, if they get any kind of balance issues or even fatigue, sleep issues, I find that responds quite well to underlying. I mean, we could put this under the umbrella of B vitamin deficiencies. In fact, that's probably the way that I would describe it. Is B vitamin deficiencies are really quite common on carnivore, and you think looking at the RDA that it wouldn't be the case. But for instance, if someone's eating too much fat, it could be pretty easy for them to develop a riboflavin issue. If they are, if they're not eating organ meats, it can be very easy for them to develop a folate problem. In fact, I run a lot of lab work, so I run lab work on. I've got years worth of lab work on carnivores now, and some of the most common deficiencies that I see is folate. That's for sure. I see folate is really quite commonly low. Riboflavin, so the functional markers for riboflavin, I see them frequently low. Biotin, I see that's quite low. Thiamine is a little bit more difficult to test, but those three very common, and vitamin C. As per the minerals, I find copper generally, if people overconsume muscle meats, like I've said, copper is quite frequently low. This is based on kind of like around thinking. There's no measurement for this. Molybdenum is something which is, you can get it from liver, but it's quite high in legumes, it's high in grains, etc. And it can be pretty low when someone is on a carnivore diet. And the more protein that you're eating, or the more sulfur containing protein that you're eating, can increase the requirement for molybdenum. So one of the things that I do see in some people is that they develop like a sulfur intolerance. This is also quite common, is that when they develop issues metabolizing sulfites, may be found in wine, or when they develop sulfur type flatulence, or they have problem tolerating sulfur and sulfur compounds and sulfites, that in many cases is a subclinical molybdenum deficiency, and that can be addressed by taking molybdenum. I mean, what else? One other thing that I see really frequently, sorry, I don't want to go on too long. Another thing, which of course people will talk about theoretically, but I see it on lab work all the time, and I know that it happens, it's really common, is an imbalance between methionine and glycine. That is, you're familiar with the concept of that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is absolutely rife within this community because people do not consume enough collagen. They just don't. And so what ends up happening is that the sheer amount of methionine, you have a system whereby you use glycine to buffer excess methionine. And so if someone eats excess methionine and they do not consume enough glycine, not only do you end up with where you waste glycine, you actually lose it. But what will also happen is, I mean, a lot of the criticisms from the plant-based community is that the research looking at longevity and health outcomes is specifically based on methionine excess and glycine depletion. And, that's one of the arguments that they say you don't want to eat excess protein. What that basically translates to physiologically is you don't want to have excess methionine. And that's true. The only way to balance out excess methionine is by getting enough glycine. So what I would say is that if someone, and this comes back to the case for supplements, if someone does not like to consume the connective tissue, if someone likes to eat a lot of muscle meat, and at the same time, if they don't like to consume collagen, as in collagen powder, they categorically should be consuming glycine supplements, without a doubt. Unless you're one of the strange people who can make enough of it kind of thing, or can preserve it in some way. Overall, I see it really commonly. 90% of the amino acid panels that I run, glycine is in like the first percentile. So it's first quintile, which means it's low, and methionine is on the high side. So I would say that overall, that's really common. One other thing that is more benign, without going into like the complex conditions, a really benign thing is actually skin issues. So things like dandruff, things like seborrheic dermatitis, so that's dry skin around the beard, around the face, and sometimes acne and oily skin. Like that is something which in some cases actually comes on after starting carnivore. So someone will have clear skin beforehand, they start consuming high amounts of saturated fat, and all of a sudden they develop severe like seborrheic dermatitis, dry skin, rashes on their face, oily skin, sometimes acne, dandruff, etc. I've made a couple of videos about this. What I think it tends to be related to is an excess consumption of fat relative to the amount of B2 and biotin. So two of the B vitamins. What can happen is that when these are low, because excess fat or consuming high amounts of fat increases the requirement for those things. So when those two things are low, what can end up happening is that changes the microbiome on the skin, or it changes the composition of the sebum coming out of the skin, and they end up with rashes all around their face and dry skin. One of the easy ways to remedy that is simply by taking riboflavin at around 50 milligrams to 100 milligrams per day for a month, and biotin anywhere from 500 to 5,000 micrograms per day, probably for around a month. Now, if it doesn't resolve, what I often find is this also relates to the gut as well. And this is some unfortunate individuals, is that simply for whatever reason, either genetically or because of the composition of the microbes in the gut, they have an issue with saturated fat. Okay. And this is something that we haven't spoken about previously, which I categorically do think is really important. And I think it's one of the reasons why people do terribly with carnivore. It's one of the reasons why I did not do well on a beef only, like beef and lamb carnivore diet. I do so much better with pork and some monounsaturated fat. Right. So certain people, there are certain genetics which don't appear to be that good at actually breaking down saturated fat. But there's also like a phenomena which, if I remember correctly, I mean, I might be butchering this term. I think it's referred to as lipid rafts. Basically, if someone has intestinal permeability, or if they have a certain composition of microbes in the gut, then the overconsumption of saturated fat, you see, saturated fat acts as a house, or as a carrier, a taxi cab, you can think of it, for endotoxin, LPS. And so what saturated fat can do is carry, do you know what LPS is?
Yeah. Well, I can't.
Lipopolysaccharide.
Yes. I have a different word. I call it little pieces of, with the curse word. That's what I call it, because it's so bad for you.
Yeah, no, it's exactly little pieces of the curse word.
Yeah.
Now that's basically what it is, right? The anaerobic bacteria, so gram-negative bacteria, what they do is they generate this kind of toxic compound, and it's perceived by the body as like an evidence of inflammation or evidence of infection. So the body mounts a very strong immunological reaction to it in many cases, not all cases, but in, for the most part. So LPS triggers inflammation. It's synonymous with inflammation. Okay. That's how they actually perform inflammation studies. In animals, they will just, they'll like inject a LPS, for instance, and that's how they like measure anti-inflammatories. So basically, LPS ordinarily, if the gut barrier if there's like good integrity of the gut barrier, it's well sealed. You'll always have some LPS, but the majority of it is not going to be getting past the gut barrier into the bloodstream. You're not going to be getting any major inflammation. Your immune system is not going to be hyperreactive to that. But if there is intestinal permeability, or if for whatever reason someone has a problem with like emulsifying, digesting saturated fat malabsorption, or a difficulty with digesting saturated fat, you see, saturated fat acts as a taxi cab. It basically LPS like gets onto the like it gets into the fat molecule kind of thing, where it binds onto it, and the fat can actually carry it into the body. Okay. And so because of that, what you can end up with is that when someone eats saturated fat, they get like a systemic inflammatory reaction. Now, that's not necessarily going to show up in any of their symptoms. They might not feel it, but one of the things that it might do theoretically is trigger some kind of an inflammation, which appears on the skin. Now, I have seen several individuals who have, say, rheumatoid arthritis, some other autoimmune condition, who notice that the autoimmunity is driven or is exacerbated when they consume saturated fat. I've seen it with skin issues, gut issues, inflammatory issues, autoimmune issues. There does seem to be this thing. So anyone who tells you that saturated fat is like objectively healthy for everyone and that is objectively safe for everyone, they haven't worked with enough people on a carnivore diet.
Right.
But ultimately, there has to be some kind of an individualization. And what I would say to your listeners is that although saturated fat for the most part is like a very optimal fat, it's very safe and it's advisable for a lot of people. If you are one of the people who doesn't feel that you do well with saturated fat, and I am one of those people, like I admit I am one of those people, if you don't do well with saturated fat, it could be genetic, it could be acquired, who knows, you might actually do better with changing your fat sources and actually, God forbid, adding in olive oil or some kind of like a pork fat, make it pork fat your primary source. Now it does contain more PUFA, although I mean there's got to be a trade-off. You don't want to be consuming something which is like directly inflammatory for your system. It takes getting to know your body kind of thing. What I would say is don't be too set in your approach, be willing to live your body and adapt it the way that you want to, the way that you kind of need to how it suits you.
I agree 100%. Yeah. Well, this has been very educational and very helpful. And I feel like there's so much we could keep talking about here, but where can people find you if they want to work with you or if they want to just learn more about all the things that you teach and offer?
Yeah, okay. So I have a website. It's called eonutrition.co.uk. I am on YouTube as EO Nutrition. I have a Facebook page, which I don't really keep up to date that much. I have an Instagram, which I don't know how to use really. I've done a couple of posts, or my PA has done some posts for me. I don't really use it. And I've also got a Twitter, which I also don't really know how to use that much. But those are kind of recent developments. So I am looking to kind of start posting more content on my website, on YouTube in the future. If people do want to work with me, I'm not currently taking on clients at the moment. I've got a couple of other projects that I'm working on. I do have a wait list, but I think it's at least kind of 6 months at this point, or maybe a little bit less. If someone really wants to work with me and they want to wait that long, then by all means they should get in contact. Otherwise, follow me on kind of my social media or on my YouTube and keep up to date. I tend to make videos on all kinds of topic. As I said, like earlier, my main focus at the moment has been on using vitamin B1 clinically. I find that I'm getting really good results with that with specific health conditions. So I'm trying to educate people on the kind of thing that can be used for. But again, I like to take an animal-based approach and try to look at some of the ways that the carnivore diet can be individualized or optimized for different people, and how it can be kind of supplemented, or how people can benefit from it who don't currently benefit from it just using diet alone. That's what I'm primarily interested in. So it's for the people who need an extra helping hand kind of thing. That's probably everything at the moment. Maybe more in the future, but we'll see.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and talking today. And I'll make sure to link everything below so people know where to find you.
Cool. Thanks for having me on. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you.